All right, welcome everyone. I'm Chris Corbin. This is my colleague Cody Thomas. And today we'll be talking to you guys about how to attack with threat intelligence. First things first, a little bit about us. I'm a cybersecurity engineer. I do research and development for an organization called MITRE. For those of you not familiar, MITRE is a federally funded research and development center where we try to tackle subjects or problems that are industry-wide in an effort to bring, the level of safety for everyone higher. I've been working with ATT&CKing in some shape, way, or form for the past 5 or so years, pretty much my entire time at MITRE. And most recently, I've been using ATT&CKing to create adversary emulation plans, and that's what we'll be talking about today: how to create these adversary emulation plans, how to use them, and how to effectively become a better red teamer or blue teamer for that matter.
I'm Cody Thomas, also working at MITRE with Chris, only for about 2 years though. Before, we've had ATT&CKing focused largely on Windows, so I went ahead and pushed for it to come out into more of Mac and Linux domain. And then, so most of my background is more in red teaming and tool development, and so that you'll see that kind of pop up throughout the presentation as we get kind of hands-on technical details of using this to be more of a red team and active on network.
Awesome. So first things first, I wanted to start with what we think the root cause or the problem or root problem really is for a lot of the issues that we're trying to solve. And as you can see above, what we think that is this traditional offensive testing workflow. So any sort of cyber game or maybe a pen test or a red team, blue team, we tend to see way more often than we would hope this sort of traditional workflow where you have red doing their own thing, blue doing their own thing, not a lot of interaction. A lot of times they're butting heads, there's some politics involved, and there's a lot of problems here that we really need to aim to solve in order to take these games to the next level, to have red and blue events become more valuable. So yeah, red will typically come in and after determining scope with the network owner and the objectives, they'll start going through their kill chain, they'll start doing their discovery, maybe their initial access, trying to get onto the machine, a single machine, and then moving laterally from there, maybe escalating privileges if needed, laying persistence down, and then finally maybe exfiltration or attempt to get to domain admin or something along those lines. At the end, they basically just take everything they did and everything they tried, what worked and what didn't. They'll throw that all into a report and just toss it over the fence. The blue team, on the other hand, if they even know a red team is going on, and usually they may or may not, they're doing their just regular day job. They're collecting, protecting, collecting it off their network. They're trying to protect their network as well, detecting any malicious behavior and triaging any alerts that pop up and whatnot. So when this happens, we end up with some of these traditional outcomes. If we're measuring red's success on how far they were able to penetrate into a network, or basically how far they were able, or how many things they were able to steal, what this does is cause a certain problem in that they're not necessarily testing the blue team, they're testing the network and the blue team's maybe defenses as a whole, instead of maybe providing them slightly better and more focused results or things for them to look out for. They basically, in that report that they write at the end, they'll just they'll put all the techniques, and they'll put any IOCs, indicators of compromise, for all the stuff they did. So these are your file hashes, your file names, what IPs and domain names they came from, and their C2 and whatnot. So if, depending on who's responsible for cleanup, blue team can make sure that none of that's still in their environment. And like I said, if red's measured on how many documents they're able to steal or anything like that, next year they're going to make sure that they, or not next year, but the next time they come in, they really want to make sure that they're able to win again next time. And this is the mentality that I think is really the whole win-lose mentality is something that we're trying to target here. Blue, on the other hand, once they receive that report, they just, they're just doing their daily job and dealing with their daily incident response, and they get this huge, massive report from red that, hey, this is all the ways that you guys failed at your job. Obviously, that's pretty much sucks to hear, and you're not, as a blue teamer, you're not really going to enjoy working with a red teamer, and this is going to start creating a divide. So what would the blue teamer at this case do with the report that was generated? Well, they would go through, see what worked that the red team tried, and try to remediate that stuff. No one has as much time as they want these days, especially in this area. So what they end up doing is just basically creating static detections for the red team's tools and whatnot, things that are very fragile. And things that may stop this red team if they were to do the exact same thing again, but the next time red team comes, that may not mean stop anything, or let alone a real adversary. If they did want to go the next step up and sort of take a look at the actual behavior that the red team was implementing or doing on their environment or in their environment, they don't have the amount of a really good sample size. They really only have that one, if they didn't know the red team was going on, they just have, what they've collected historically, and they need to go through that and comb through it. So if they do create a defense in this case, they can't really test it for the false positives or tweak it, because you can't bring them in, bring the red team in as often as you'd like with this setup, and have them test your defenses. So how does the red team in this case and the blue team progress? So as we said, there's fragile detections that are being created, static ones as well. So blue sees that red's been using this one tool with a specific hash on all the machines they compromised. That's an easy one. They'll just find the hash and label it as bad and have whatever mechanism they have to remove that, and go ahead and remove that. Red, however, next time they come, they try it, they see that as soon as their file hits disk, it disappears. Well, they just recycle that, and they just recompile that with some very minor modification or any sort of obfuscation, and they're past that one file hash check. Next time, blue takes a look at the report and sees what they did. They're like, okay, well, maybe we can't focus on hashes. Let's see about maybe strings, maybe a Yara rule of some sort or something along those lines. They see Mimikatz in the tool. Okay, red team sees the same thing as well when they're running their tool. They see that, so they remove maybe debug strings or just change up the strings, or again, some sort of obfuscation. And they just keep alternating back and forth this way. And as I said, these, in the traditional red and blue, these aren't happening very quick after, these aren't iterative. These are, there's a significant amount of time happening between the red or after the red events, after the blue, and with the blue dealing with red. And then the cycle continues that way. So in reality, there's a lot of time that this is taking for us not to really progress as both red or blue. We're not focusing on what we need to be focusing here. The defense of the network isn't really increasing that well. Finally, maybe blue takes a little bit of time. They step back and they realize, okay, so they saw that the red team was using PS-exact for lateral movement. Maybe they already have some sensors in place on their network. They can tell that PS-exact really isn't used in our environment legitimately. So let's go ahead and shut that down. So now we're starting to think with some sort of TTP or behavior that we're now killing for the red team as an actual TTP they can use. The red team will realize this, and when that stops working, they'll have to find some other way to laterally move. That's the only way they knew how to. They're be pretty much in a situation where they find themselves needing to find a different way and pretty much do it live. So what can we do at this point to really help red and blue skip, maybe have a shortcut to thinking to TTPs instead of maybe just some of the like hashes or the strings? Well, with that, we have this diagram here. For those of you who are not familiar with this is David Bianco's pyramid of pain. It's usually presented as a way to prioritize blue defenses. Basically, all it's trying to illustrate is starting at the bottom. Those are the easiest things for an adversary to change. It won't cost them much time or resources. Those are things like your hash values, your IP addresses, domain names. There's always, you can always register new domains or compromise easy domains that already exist. But as we traverse this pyramid to the top, we started seeing things like network and host artifacts starting to get a little annoying to change. And also tools. And the hardest thing, the toughest thing for an adversary to change are their TTPs. Well, there's several reasons for this, but I mean, simply put, there's a finite amount of ways that Windows will allow you to do remote execution of code, for example. Now, as I said, this is usually presented with a blue sort of shade. But as a red teamer, how can you also use this? Everything in the bottom of half of this, the bottom half, maybe all the way up to network and host artifacts, this is the stuff you want to be varying as a second nature by now. So every time you roll a new C2, make sure you change all your defaults and you maybe set up some backup protocols and whatnot. and let alone hash values that you should be randomizing pretty much every time you create a new payload of some sort. But more importantly, we need a focus at the top, right? That's where the most important thing. So that's if you get caught, your TTPs get caught, you basically have the potential to get hamstrung and stuck in a sticky situation. So again, if you only have like one TTP for lateral movement, maybe you need to, expand on that and look into what else is out there. So one of the things we realized as a good way to have red and blue, both of them together, focus on the top of this pyramid in how they prioritize their work, and also help them work together, is to provide them with a common language that is based on TTPs. It's based on TTPs and also provides them several things that enables them to do their job easier together. So what are these things that we need from this language to provide that for us? Well, first and foremost, we need to be able to communicate and articulate exactly what happened in an actual event and what was responded to. So as the red team, you have these amounts of TTPs that you've tried, and you go ahead and you say, okay, well, this kind of lateral movement worked, this kind of privilege escalation worked, this kind of persistence worked, and all these others didn't. At the same time, the blue team can then focus their work, okay, we see that this TTP for lateral movement has been used, and it's actually a fairly common one, so maybe we should be prioritizing some defenses there. And that sort of helps them move away from the hashes and all that sort of, the easily, I guess, pretty fragile detections that one would automatically go to if they were, in a jam and didn't have enough time to properly step back and take a look at what the problem was. The second thing we need from this common language is we need to be able to have it articulate at a specific enough level that it's repeatable. So what happened has to be repeatable from one event to the next. And in doing so, we're sort of moving away from like the art of this to this more science and repeatable fashion. So now we can start creating metrics for ourselves, how we performed last year versus this year, what new things we introduced into our environment, if it worked or didn't, and basically see how well we're doing. So what do we use personally for this common language? Well, we use MITRE's adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge, or more commonly referred to as ATT&CKing. So just a quick show of hands, even though I can't really see too many people. Who here is at least familiar with ATT&CKing or used it or, okay, awesome, thanks. So what is ATT&CKing? ATT&CKing is a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. But it's based on things we've seen in the wild that adversaries have actually done. So things we see in threat intel reports, I think, if specific APT has been known to do something, or maybe someone's reverse engineered a piece of malware and it was known to perform like function A, B, and C, that is what ends up in ATT&CKing. We take a look at that, and with the help of the community, we've created this framework where you can find across 11 tactics, and I'll explain that in a quick second, how it's organized. But yeah, basically our real world observations of adversaries. And increasingly more and more so, the communities has been starting to use this as a common language, and we've already started to see some really good results. Oh, and it is also available at attack.miter.org, publicly released and everything. So once you actually go there, you're presented with this attack matrix over here. Across the top in the blue row, the first row, that is what a tactic is. That's basically the adversary's technical goal, or the why. So why is it they're doing what they're doing? Now, under each tactic, you have a series of, so along the columns, you have the series of techniques. This is basically what the adversary is actually doing to achieve that goal. So that's the what. We have 11 different tactics across the top, and we have, I believe, over 217 techniques at this point. And it's just growing by the day. But up until recently, our most recent added tactic was the initial access tactic. But before that, it was all, and I'll read some of these across the top. You have execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, lateral movement, collection, exfiltration, and finally command and control. You could start to see a pattern emerging from that, in that this is all mostly post-exploit with, basically taking an assume breach mentality. So the adversary is already in your network. This is how you can move about as an adversary within the network, or, persist, or, perform your actions and objectives. And the initial access starts to blur that sort of post-exploit line. But, if we were to click on one of the techniques, specifically the new service under persistence, this is what you start to see. This is just a brief amount of data. There's much more on the actual website. But the first thing we start off is describing how this actual technique, so a new service within Windows, how that is actually used legitimately, why it's actually brought out in Windows, why it's there, and like how someone like maybe an IT admin or the Windows system itself uses this legitimately. We then move into how adversaries actually abuse this for their own gain. We have some data about like what platforms you find this, what the required permissions and effective permissions. And then we move into the detection and mitigation, how you detect or mitigate this specific TTP. As a red teamer, this is a really good place for you to be paying attention to, because you can start to see what what the blue team's playbook would be against a specific TTP of yours. This is basically building into your OPSEC and providing you the means to sort of maybe measure up against one TTP over another, and how easy it is you think it would be to detect, depending on how mature that network is, of course. Furthermore, if you look at a specific tactic, let's say lateral movement, and you realize that you only know how to do and you only have the tooling and tested the tooling for one of them, you can see what else is available there and see whether or not that works in the environment that you're going up against. So it provides you that sort of breadth and width of techniques in this case. And finally, and also really interestingly and importantly to me at least, are the examples. As I said, all this is based on real adversaries, what we've seen them really do. So in this case, we point at, we have, we cite backwards to all the different reports that we've seen different groups and different adversaries actually use this technique, whether they did it on the command line or a piece of their software actually has it as a built-in as a function. But either way, we have this, we have them all linked in the example sort of section. And if you were to go there and follow that thread, you'll start to see exactly how they implemented this technique. And that'll give you guys information on how you would be able to implement that technique as well. There's a lot of ways to implement the technique. It's not just one. And this is one of the places where you can start building out that arsenal of yours. So far, what we've seen so far has mostly been just for enterprise Windows, basically like a Active Directory domain focused. But we also, thanks to Cody, have now Linux and Mac attack. Also, we've released the Android and iOS. And also, even more so, we went a little bit left of exploit and focused on some of those behaviors of TTPs with pre-attack. So those are some of the extra ones that are the extra domains that attack focuses on. There's many different use cases for attack, but I'm not really going to go into many of them, and I'm going to just sort of jump to that fourth one right there, which is adversary emulation. How can we use attack to actually emulate adversaries and emulate specific adversaries? And that's going to be what the rest of our presentation is actually about. So what is adversary emulation? There's a lot of different, words or names for, the newest flavor of offensive testing, be it, penetration testing, or, red teaming, or purple teaming, or adversary simulation, emulation, etc. What we really mean by adversary emulation is just sort of honest-to-goodness, threat-based red teaming. So when we perform our red actions, we're coming in with a threat flavor. This provides us quite a bit of benefits in doing so. The first one is, as I said, there was about 200 overtone techniques in attack. This provides both red and blue a way to start prioritizing what defenses to start building out against which techniques. If you were to, for example, be really interested in a specific APT, you could follow their MO and try to understand how they're actually transitioning from the initial access all the way through their action on an objective all the way at the end, and what their objective actually is. Because, not everyone's final objective is to get domain admin. They could be there just to steal data, for example, or just persist and wait until something happens at a later time. But, basically, when you enter, when you're approached with the task of adversary emulation, you don't want to just show up as just a general, regular, advanced adversary, or like, maybe act like an APT. We want to be a very specific one, and a very specific APT, because there's also something to gain from doing that. And that is, you'd be able to map that, or you'd be able to give the blue team experience against an adversary they may actually be up against. So for example, if they're in a specific industry that's known to be targeted by a specific type of APT, maybe, or an adversary, like maybe a country-specific one, I'd try and identify what that specific adversary does in terms of TTPs and their MO. You can be able to give your blue teams, you can be able to exercise them, without actually detonating some real APT binaries on your machines. So speaking of which, something we've released to basically help everyone bootstrap into this adversary emulation using attack is our APT3 prototype for adversary emulation. This is an A to Z plan that you guys can take. It'll give you all information you need, well, most of it, on how to emulate APT3 within your network. So we go through, we identify all the tooling that they've used, or most of the tooling that they've used, and we go through all the intel about the different kinds of reverse engineering and what's been seen by the incident response teams responding to this APT. And we also present you guys, or present in the emulation plan, different ways to emulate that with your own tooling, be it on the command line or open source things. And it's available over here under on the attack website under adversary emulation plans, and that is actually what Cody will be going into a little more detail after I start, or after I hand it over to him. But all right, so now we've provided you guys with APT3, but what if that's not necessarily something you're interested in? Maybe you work for a financial company or in the financial sector. Maybe one of the the financial groups, Fin6 or Fin7, would be more apt for you to actually emulate. This gives you a better story to be able to actually sell sell basically what your job is. But again, alluding back to being able to exercise the blue team against a potential real threat and do things as the APT would specifically do. So you do want to identify what adversary would actually be targeting the networks that you're targeting and attempt to match that up. So once you've actually done this, and once you've identified the adversary that you want to emulate, I'm going to hand it over to Cody, and he's going to show you how, through 5 steps, go ahead and emulate that adversary.
So Chris has already kind of talked to you about the background of attack, how we go about approaching this, what is adversary emulation, all that sort of stuff. But I like to kind of ground everything in examples and kind of walk you through it. So for the next rest of this presentation, I'm going to be going through our APT3 emulation plan, how we came about it, what steps you need to consider, how you might do your tooling, and all that sort of stuff. So the first thing, as you go through, say you want to emulate APT3. So now you need to kind of go out and get the threat intel on that adversary. It's a little bit hard based off of just kind of the threat landscape that's out there right now. So there's a couple things that you have to consider as you go about doing this. So for example, if you want to look for APT3, you can Google for APT3 or look at your paid threat intel feeds or anything like that, but you can't just stop there. So there's kind of a hot topic in the threat intel community right now about aliases for different adversaries and groups and operations and all this sort of stuff. So you have to keep that in mind as you go through and do your research into the specific adversaries, because one adversary may be known by 15 different aliases across different companies that are reporting on it. Additionally, as you go through and see that, okay, you're looking at APT3, but APT3 uses PlugX and Perpy and PSExec and all these different tools, you need to continue doing research into those tools themselves to kind of get the most bang for your buck out of what the adversary is doing. And of course, with the associated campaigns, not only are adversaries tied to specific instances, specific events, but sometimes they're broadened out into these larger campaigns describing how they're operating. So I'll go ahead and give an example of this. But one thing to keep in mind as you start Googling around and looking for information is when these reports are released. So people have been putting out reports on adversaries for years and years now. As you go through and you start pulling this threat intel information to kind of build your profile for the adversary, you need to think about when the report was released. Just like us, adversaries change their tactics over time. So if all of your reports are 7 years ago and you're trying to emulate the adversary now, kind of keep that in mind and try and think of how things may have changed over time. So if we start actually looking at some threat reports, you'll see here is a simple one from Symantec. And here all I did was Google for APT3, but right away you can see that they're also known as Buckeye, Gothic Panda, UPS Team, Threat Group 0110. If you start Googling even those, you'll see Operation Double Tap, Operation Clandestine Fox, UPS. Like all these sorts of things start quickly bubbling up to the front of each other. So even as you keep going, you'll see sometimes, here's an example where APT3 Gothic Panda we already saw, but they're also referring to this group as Perpy. Now, Perpy is actually one of APT3 malware samples. So there's already some conflating going on between what the group is doing and what the tools can do. So this is just something you have to kind of keep in mind and really research as you go through looking at these reports. So once you get all these reports, you start Googling, you follow the name, Google this other term, you get all this stuff together. Now what? What are you supposed to do from there? So in this part, we're actually going to start going through those reports and looking to see what are the adversaries' behavior. What is the behavior of the tools they can do? If possible, and not always possible from strictly open source intelligence, but trying to figure out what motivates the adversary. What is it they're looking for? What's their MO? How do they operate on a network? Even once you get on a network, not every adversary is going to look for the same thing, move the same way, have the same kinds of infrastructure. And as you start going through this, and this is why I like using attack for this, you start to think about the what, the why, and the how. What it is they're doing, this is the specific technique and attack that they're doing, why they're doing it, that goes back to that tactic level, what are they trying to achieve, and then the nitty-gritty detail part, the how, what's the specific implementation of what they're doing. And this is where you can get a lot of nice variation to help you as the offensive team and to help the defenders build up their analytics. So there are three main kinds of reporting that I usually see as we go through and trying to pull out techniques for us to do adversary emulation. We get this kind that, and I'll step into this a little bit more, but we get this kind that's more of a prose writing, paragraph after paragraph of somebody describing what's happening. Sometimes in the next example, I'll show that we get a little bit more in-depth of a specific binary. So somebody taking an instance of Perpy and doing malware analysis on it, running strings on it, and providing that information back. And the last kind is somewhere in between, where we get a bit of information on specific pieces of malware that are used and details about them, but more in a prose style. So if you see this sort of blob in your reporting and you're trying to figure out, okay, I'm the red teamer, this is just a threat intel report, what am I supposed to gather from this? How do I use it? So you can start looking through the data and trying to pull out, remember, the what, the why, and the how. So you can see here already that we're looking at a CVE for privilege escalation. They're trying to do an exploit. The fact that it's CVE 2014-4113 doesn't matter as much as the fact of the behavior. They're using exploits on the system. This is compared to maybe doing path interception, overwriting files on the system, this sort of stuff. It gives you an idea of what kinds of stuff they're doing, trying to get more towards their behavior. You can also see other things like here, we have CMD WAC-C, who am I? This tells you a couple of things already right off the bat. First, that they're doing things on the command line. So they're not strictly doing everything with APIs, having their own things installed on the system. They're using some of the kind of live off the land stuff that we see. And you can see with them doing who am I, they're trying to do a little bit of discovery to see where they are, what kind of permissions they have. As we continue on, you can see things like running scheduled tasks to create persistence. And this is something, what kinds of persistence they're trying to get, whether it's user lane persistence, whether they're getting elevated persistence. Here you can see that they're specifically running a system, so it's more of an elevated persistence. And one of the things you'll notice as you go through and start looking at all this threat intel reporting is it's kind of biased towards what is seen when people come in to do the remediation. So lots of this stuff comes out as people figure out that they're hacked in some way, and then somebody comes in, triages it, helps fix the system, kick out the bad guy. So in that last part where you actually have the company coming in that's going to be doing the reporting, there's a subset of attack that they're more likely to see than others. And part of this being like C2 channels, persistence mechanisms, that sort of stuff, rather than maybe what a user is sitting doing on command line in volatile memory that, depending on when the incident response team comes in, may be long gone. So because of this, you'll start to see things talking about C2 channels way, way more often than others. And here we can see an example of just raw connections out to specific ports that aren't very common. And specifically, this one goes more in depth into, okay, you have this connection, what are they sending? Are they sending strings? Is it just another protocol over this random port? Here, they're actually defining their own custom command and control protocol. So it kind of gives you an idea of the kind of stuff that you're going to have to do if you want to emulate this adversary. You can't just simply run PowerShell with RESTful APIs and going to look like this adversary. You have to think a little bit more about it. So the second example I was talking about is you get a little bit more in-depth detail into a specific instance of binaries. Here we see somebody went through and did a presentation specifically on Perpy, and in one of the copies they found, they dumped the strings and found a whole bunch of awesome command lines that people had been running from the binary. And so we can see here already that, for example, they're doing permission groups discovery by trying to see who's admin where. And one interesting thing to note about this part is you can already see that there's some redundancy. Looking at the local group administrator / domain and the net group domain admin / domain is going to give you a lot of the same information because both of those are kind of looking for the elevated admins across the domain. So adversaries themselves building in this kind of redundancy should give you a clue that even us as red teamers trying to do this sort of adversary emulation, having that in the back of your mind is a good idea. And we can continue on seeing that they're looking for network connections and remote systems, the sort of stuff that you normally do as part of your normal red teaming. You're just maybe not thinking about it in this way. One interesting thing to note with this sort of analysis that you get in threat reporting is that, for example, you see the c::aos.exe and this net start and stop for AOS. Now, if you just look at this blindly, you may just say, okay, they're running command line and they can start and stop services, and you move on. But if you start thinking more into this, what is AOS? Is this an actual Windows service that could exist? Is this something they created? Normally, binaries don't just exist at c:/. They're in subdirectories. So what's the purpose of putting a binary right there up at the front? You see this more often in things like path interception, where there's an unquoted service path that they're trying to interrupt. So that could be an example here of having to dig a little bit deeper into this kind of non-prose style just dump of data about a binary. Then, of course, you have more of your common discovering processes, file deletions, that sort of stuff that you see more in advanced adversaries trying to clean up from themselves, doing more discovery, trying to get better awareness of the system. And so the last kind of threat intel report that I was talking about is somewhere in between the two. So it's not just a straight up blob of text talking about things, but it's more than just one specific binary. So here they're breaking out 3 different tools that they've seen: a keylogger, a remote CMD tool, and a PWDump variant. And with these, sometimes you get some of your standard, your keylogger records keystrokes, go figure. So obviously input capture. Then you get some sort of additional sneak peeks into things like, oh, okay, not only is it recording keystrokes, they're not saving them into memory, they're dumping them out into encrypted files. So this kind of gives you an idea of other things that you might think about the system. If you're going through and doing normal red teaming type things, especially these days, you tend to be more hesitant to touch disk at all. Anything you can do in memory is fine. But as you go through, you see adversaries still doing things where they touch disk. So try and keep that kind of risk profile in your mind as you go through doing this sort of emulation. And then, of course, another oddity here is a keylogger that gathers network information. Not something you see very often, but it's an interesting thing to note that these tools aren't just one-off sole purposes. Sometimes they're a little bit multifaceted. Another example here, and this goes into the kind of follow the leads type of thing that you have to do as you go into research for these sorts of things, is this remote CMD tool. As they describe it in terms of another tool. So they say, oh, this is similar to PSExec. And then they don't go much beyond that. So now you have to go and think, okay, what is PSExec? What is that doing? How does it work? And so if you dig into that a little bit more, you'll see that it's specifically mounting Windows admin shares, copying files over, starting services to do some lateral movement. So you have to kind of keep that sort of stuff in mind and dig into these a little bit more. And then, of course, everybody loves dumping credentials. And here we see this PWDump that's doing get hash. But one interesting thing to note about this is instead of doing maybe get hashes by looking at the system and SAM files on disk, this one's specifically injecting into LSASS. So this might be something that you'd see more commonly with things like Mimikatz. So it's just something to keep in mind as you go through looking at doing emulation, how these things are happening.
So what Cody's been doing here, actually, as you guys can see when he maps these back, he's mapping everything he's found back to attack. Each one of these IDs here, which is the T followed by the 4 numbers, that's a specific attack technique, and that's the attack ID specifically T, like 1055 being process injection. So you'd be able to, by mapping it back to attack, you can see what that specifically is doing. You go into that technique and gain more information, maybe also get different variants and see also how other groups, not just APT3 in this case, but how other groups do that specific technique.
Yep, and this is one way that you can do that sort of red-blue collaboration. If everybody's speaking in the same T number, the same technique style, then it's a little bit easier to talk to each other than if red is talking about Mimikatz command lines and blue is talking about, access codes for process accesses. So it helps you kind of bridge this gap between talking. So that's now talking about, we've covered, finding the intel, looking at it to see what kind of behaviors are there, but there's still one extra piece as part of this step, looking into the adversary MO. Now, this is one of the hardest pieces, depending on how active the adversary is, how much reporting there is on them, and even the kinds of reporting, you may not be able to get this. So it all just depends on what's out there, but when you do start looking through these reports, there are sections in there that aren't specifically tied to what this tool can do, what hex values are in this string, that sort of stuff. And so you have to kind of read between the lines and start picking out more of a why for the group instead of a specific tool. So here's an example pulled from Symantec talking about Buckeye, which is another alias for APT3. But the interesting part here is they say, Buckeye seems to target file and print servers, which makes it likely that the group is looking to steal documents. So that already gives you some idea of, okay, once I get into the network, I'm not looking for domain admin. I'm not looking, to get this specific user's account to troll them. I specifically want to find areas in the network that have high concentrations of documents so that I can steal them. Gives you some more of a rationale of why you're even attacking this network in the first place. If we keep looking at other things, you'll see here one from FireEye where it talks about them being extremely proficient at lateral movement and not reusing command and control infrastructure. So this gives you more of an idea as you go through, okay, not only are they looking for all these kinds of documents in the network, but they're actually moving onto these other boxes, maybe to collect them, maybe to have better awareness and spread throughout the network, but they're definitely spreading out quickly and they do it very well. So it gives you some rationale for once you get in the network, how are you going to propagate? Additionally, with the comment about the command and control infrastructure, if you go through, you'll see some adversaries that will get onto a network, maybe be super fast and noisy, drop some commodity malware or something that's out there, and then if they determine that it's a useful target, drop in a second type of malware that's more stealthy, more custom made, and attempt to have that one kind of lay low and slow longer term. So the point here about not reusing command and control is interesting to note that if you're going to go through doing that, maybe using different tool sets, don't reuse the command and control infrastructure. Keep those as separate as possible. And finally, here's another one where it's talking about the actual initial access part that they used. Specifically, the self-extracting RAR archive was created 5 to 6 months before the attack. So this gives you some idea that as they go through and they're preparing to spearfish the way into an environment or do watering hole attacks or whatnot, they're creating these payloads months and months in advance. They're rehearsing this type of thing. They're looking into how it works. Once they get it working, keeping that safe and maybe swapping out the payloads inside of it, but not really changing up their tactics that much, right? They're still doing the same sort of thing, but they have a lot of preparation leading up to this. So taking these sorts of things together, you can create what we have as an emulation plan. Now, this is definitely the hardest part of the puzzle because it's way less straightforward. The data may not even be out there, but you just kind of have to try and think about it. And that goes back to the MO pieces that we were just talking about. No plan will be perfect. It's okay. You can approximate where needed. And remember, as you go through and you're doing this sort of adversary emulation, your goal isn't to be an exact replica of a prior incident that happened. You're trying to provide some sort of variation and behave like the adversary. Right? The adversary isn't going to do the exact same thing twice over and over again because as it is, defenders are already looking at file hashes. So right there already doing the same thing over and over again isn't going to help you. So it's okay to have this sort of variation. And if you can see here, we have the 3 phases for our emulation plan that kind of corresponds to the 3 types of reports I just mentioned. So you have that first phase where you're looking at long-term, setting up your infrastructure, getting your payloads ready, thinking about that, setting up multiple kinds of infrastructure, that first phase, then moving into the second phase once you get on the network and quickly moving around. Laterally moving to a bunch of different hosts, calling back to your different infrastructures, finding all the things that you think are useful, all these different file aggregation spots. And then you move into that final spot of, okay, now that you've found what you're looking for, now what? So going through, collecting the data, staging it, exfiltrating it out, right? Remember, this was your goal in emulating this adversary on the network, not just to, oh, look, I'm on 15 boxes. So what? What's the impact? What are you trying to do? That's something you have to try and keep in mind as you go about doing this. So now that you have some sort of idea of what the adversary is capable of doing, some general approach to how you want to do this, now you need some way of doing it. You're not going to go through and drop, perpy on the system. You want to be able to do this in a safer way. So this part, step 3, is going through to look at what kind of tools you need to do this. And as part of this, you may have your own tool set, purchasing tools that are out there, maybe open source ones that are there that you can use, and thinking about how do they operate? Can you extend them? Do you need to modify them? Do you need to write your own? And specifically, trying to look at these behaviors. So we keep talking about behaviors a lot. So I wanted to give a couple examples of what we mean whenever we talk about emulating these sorts of TTPs, because that's kind of a higher level, broad, abstract term. I like examples. So we already talked about a couple of these that we saw in the threat reports already. For example, if the adversary is using ps-exec for lateral movement, well, what are other ways that you can do that manually? So if you use netuse to mount the drive, copy the file over, use sc to create the services remotely, have more of this manual aspect to it, you're still doing the same attack technique. You're just changing up that how a little bit, giving a little bit more variation, but the behavior is still the same. Similarly, if the adversary is running who am I for discovery of once they get on a box, what kind of permissions do they have, where are they, that sort of thing. What if you go ahead and instead use environment variables, user domain and username? That's still a lot of the same information, the same style of doing things, but now you've tweaked things a little bit to trip up the defenders, right? Remember, you're still trying to achieve the same sort of goals, do the same style of things, but the variations are what matters here. And so as you go through doing this, just keep in mind, what it is you're trying to do and why it is you're trying to do it. The attack tactic and techniques. The variations really come into play with the how, the procedures, how it is you're implementing doing this. And so as you go through and you start looking at these, looking at your tool sets, you're going to define what it is you use. And so sometimes people will, especially these days, get so overwhelmed with PowerShell and it's the latest and greatest awesome thing. But if everything that you have is based off of PowerShell and you get into an environment and they have an XP box that doesn't have PowerShell, what do? I keep seeing people that are all PowerShell and they get on there, it's like, oh no, I know this box should have 15,000 ways of being exploited. I mean, it's XP, but there's no PowerShell, so how do I do things, right? Making sure that you have this sort of broad environment, this wide range of tools and implementations for how to do things helps you as the adversary go about your business as well. And so here's an example of breaking out some of perpy's functions, the malware, and ways that you can go about implementing them while staying within the bounds of that attack tactic and technique. So going through and having ways to do like listing processes with Windows built in. What if you did this with CMD or PowerShell? How would you do it with Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, Empire, Puppy? All these different things to have ways of going about to do this. As you go through and you start noting these things down, building out your arsenal, having all these toolkits, as a nice artifact, you kind of get this adversary emulation field manual. You get this way of illustrating and describing how you're going to go about operating on networks, emulating specific adversaries, and it's a nice way to have exact command line examples, things that you can kind of just copy in and paste, a broader knowledge that you and your team can use. So now that you kind of established how you're going to do things, you have your tools, the next step is setting up your infrastructure and getting ready. This, for our APT3 example, is that phase 1, getting everything set up, buying your domains, your redirectors, test your techniques, and of course you're going to be creating your payloads that are inspired by the adversary's tradecraft. Remember, you're not going to be dropping perpy or plugx onto your target network. You're going to be using your tools, but try and make them look closer to what the adversary will use. Now, I see this a lot of people going, obfuscate all the things. This is awesome. People like Dan Bohannon are releasing awesome tools to go out there and obfuscate all the things. But remember, obfuscation itself can be kind of a trip, an indicator of compromise that people are triggering on. And so don't obfuscate all the things. Please obfuscate with purpose. If you're obfuscating, then you're looking at something in that defense evasion tactic that we have in attack. There's a reason that you're trying to obfuscate. Why? You don't want to just obfuscate for the sake of obfuscation, but you're trying to bypass a specific signature, get rid of a specific string, that sort of stuff. So keep that in mind as you go through. And so finally, the last step for this is now that you have everything ready, you have everything set up, tested, now actually go forth and conquer. Be the adversary on that network. Emulate the adversary. Keep this flow in mind, why it is you're going about them. Remember, it's highly unlikely that domain admin is the target for an adversary, right? There's something they're trying to get. Just having a domain admin password doesn't help the company get any better, doesn't help you as the adversary do anything. There's something you're using that credential for, right? So in the APT3 example, you may not even need domain admin in the network. Maybe some users' capability and credential access can already get you onto the most valuable file share in the network and get all the documents you need. So just trying to keep that in mind as you go through, and keep in mind the speed of the adversary. Some adversaries are low and slow as they go about on different networks, maybe sending a command once a day, being super stealthy. Sometimes they're super smash, grab, light up everything, doesn't matter. They don't think this network is important, or that sort of thing. So try and remember this general MO of the adversary in mind as you go about doing this. And so as part of this, we're providing a starting point for red and blue. APT3 is already up on the website now. You're free to download it, look at it. We have command line examples as an adversary emulation field manual of things in Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, and Windows built in that you can just straight up take down and run to emulate these different techniques that we have. And we have APT29 coming out soon, but with the same sort of process all the way through what threat intelligence is out there, mapping it to attack, interesting OPSEC notes. Yep, and so at the very end, here's some links to contact us or reach out, and feel free to reach out to MITRE Attack at Twitter as well. And that's it. Thank you. I think we're right on time. All right.
And I don't know if we have time for questions, but we'll be around for the rest of the conference. We also have stickers for those who want them, so
Yes.
come find us. We'll be in the obvious attack shirts.
Yes. Please take our stickers.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.